Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1141 is a quick but sweet transitional chapter that gives us some interesting new Atom Tree lore, a cryptic scene with Jarl, and of course, the long-awaited release of Loki himself, plus a bunch more. So let's get right into it. We continue on with our 27th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story as we find Page 1 being brought in front of Who's Who. As we saw on the last cover page, Page 1's arms are still bound by sea stone cuffs, preventing him from fighting back, and Who's Who is still wielding Yasuo's blade that was stolen from Yamato several chapters ago. Beside him are two crewmates that we've seen throughout this cover story, and behind them looks to be even more remnants of the Animal Kingdom pirates who have now found a new home under Who's Who, just showing how big this whole operation has gotten. I like that we get this scene from Ulti's view as it lets us see the screen doors in the back. These could be the same ones that Yamato and Tama were peeking in from earlier in the cover story, so hopefully they'll be able to intervene and save the day soon. Quick nitpick here, in the last chapter, we saw there were two swords above Ulti's right arm, but here it seems Oda only included the one above her shoulder, probably because including the other one would obstruct Page 1's body on the floor. Now there really is not too much else to say with this one, but I guess it's as good as time as any to bring up the new Page 1 and Ulti lore that got disclosed in the Volume 111 SBS. So for context, back in Volume 100, we learned that Ulti and Page 1 were taken in by Kaido after the death of their father, who had been a rival-like figure to the Emperor. A while later, in Chapter 1100, we saw Kuma being offered a position among the 7 warlords of the sea after one of them had been defeated by a rookie ace. Many speculated who this warlord could have been until it was revealed in Volume 109's SBS that it was a pirate named Hanafuda. Strangely, Oda had provided a fully rendered drawing of his design, which is very uncommon for the SBS. Usually these characters are just doodles or sketches. There, we learned he had a hobby of collecting ancient Zoan devil fruits and that his epithet was the King of Lizards. His name is a reference to a kind of Japanese playing card, which fits in with the card game naming convention found throughout Kaido's crew, and so many fans speculated that Hanafuda had some closer relationship with Kaido, perhaps even providing the ancient Zoan devil fruits that would be found amongst the Tobiropo and All-Stars. Well, in the latest SBS found in Volume 111, we learned that Hanafuda was in fact the father of Page 1 and Ulti. After clashing with Kaido, he ended up putting his efforts into helping the Emperor and even entrusted his children under the Emperor's care. After his defeat to Ace, he wanted to reunite with Page 1 and Ulti, but was unfortunately killed by enemy pirates before he got the chance. It'll be interesting to see if this ever gets addressed in the story proper. Who knows, maybe we'll even see it in this cover story. One thing about Hanafuda's design that stood out was his very peculiar mouth or teeth. I wonder if Page 1 and Ulti both share that feature with their father, and that's the reason why they wear their masks. We'll just have to see. I guess with that, let's get into Chapter 1141, An Older Woman. We pick back up with Nami and Roto leaving Allrust Castle in the Svar. Luffy and Zoro are no longer with them, as we'll see later in the chapter, but they did take along the 2 guards from the castle. It's not clear what happened with Gaban after the previous chapter. He seems to be heading out ahead of them after telling the crew to pay him a visit before they leave, but hopefully we'll get to see him again before that. Speaking of, we do get Gaban's partner Ripley returning in this chapter as she continues the tour of the Jewel Tree Atom alongside Frankie. It looks like we're just not going to talk about the mural from a few chapters ago, which is honestly pretty fitting for Frankie. As he said himself, it's probably something more up Robin's alley, but we do get more info into the history of Elbaf in this scene. As we saw with the Western Village, it's explained that the giants essentially live on top of the individual branches of the tree, and each one has its own fabled history. So far, we have not seen any other village in Elbaf, at least as far as we know, since the Western Village is the same village that we saw back during Big Mom's flashback. But in this chapter, we learn of a new place that used to exist, called Haugen Village. Haugen is a Norwegian name that comes from the Old Norse word that meant tiny hill or grassy knoll, and we're told that sometime in the past, it was struck by lightning, which caused it to catch flame. Since it was so old, they were unable to put out the fire, and they were forced to cut the branch off to save the rest of the tree. This is actually a bit of a surprise, since up until this point, all we really knew about the tree was how strong and durable it was, so learning that it's naturally weak to things that all trees are weak to is a bit anticlimactic, but I suppose it does make sense. Plus, we have seen the Thousand Sunny, a ship made using atom wood, be set aflame before, so maybe this shouldn't have been that big of a reveal anyways. Which begs the question, why linger on something that feels so obvious? Of course trees would be susceptible to damage from lightning and fire. Well, I imagine this is a sort of Chekhov's gun situation where we will eventually see Elbaf threatened by these elements once again, and it wouldn't be the first time this outcome was suggested. In fact, this looming threat of a burning country was our very first look into what we were supposed to think was Elbaf, as earlier in the Lego village, we saw some of the inhabitants express concern for the fire spreading to the entire country if it ever reached Yggdrasil. Not only that, we also saw the Western village was somehow somehow plagued with fire when Big Mom rampaged 63 years ago, but thankfully Carmel was there to give life to the flame and create the homie Pandora, saving the day. Actually, could this be how we see Big Mom return to the story? Control over both fire and lightning is a specific power set that is relatively unique to her, and her fate was left ambiguous after the events of Wano, with some readers believing her to have died, while others suspect that she is still alive. Just several chapters ago, the Giants of Elbaf were talking about how the Straw Hats were the ones who helped take her down alongside Kaido, and Gerd revealed to them that she was once friends with her, but the Straw Hats seemed confused as to why Big Mom was relevant to the Giants in the first place. So at the very least, I can imagine that conversation would need to happen eventually, and what would prompt it better than Big Mom's presence on Elbaf? Now, of course, there are plenty of other options as well. We're still waiting to see if Enel ever comes back into play, with many fans having actually hoped that there would be some tie between the Sky People and the Elbaf Giants in this very arc. But I should note that fire and lightning were also two elements that were somewhat associated with Hyrule back during Dressrosa. His punches were compared to bolts of lightning in the Colosseum, which of course plays into him being the Thor figure to Loki, but also his entire reason for being there in the first place was to compete for the Flame Fruit. For whatever reason, Hyrule had believed that having the power of that fruit would assist him in becoming king of the Giants. Perhaps he had hoped that being able to become and manipulate fire would be useful in protecting his homeland. Now, just a few chapters ago, we also learned that Loki's pranks included arson, which now feels even more insane and dangerous, seeing as how Loki truly could have burnt down all of Elbaf. But when we met Loki initially, we saw a large hammer behind his back. This was something that we suspected to be a nod to Mjolnir from Norse mythology, the hammer that was wielded by Thor to be used in conjunction with his lightning abilities. Well, toward the very tail end of this chapter, we get the hammer's name, Ragnir, and it's certainly possible that it possesses a similar lightning power set as we are familiar with in our world. However, I'll talk more about that in detail in just a bit. Back over at the Western Village, we find the rest of the crew enjoying themselves, perhaps even a little too much, as Usopp looks to be properly intoxicated. We've seen this kind of behavior from Usopp before during celebrations like on Whiskey Peak, and it's really no surprise given how he has the 8th lowest tolerance for alcohol on the crew. Just ahead of him is Brook, who has also literally lost his head, while Jinbei is sitting rock solid and sober, being the one with the best tolerance amongst the crew. Nami expresses understanding for Usopp celebrating so hard, mentioning how this was his dream, and she's sort of right, but not completely. Her understanding of Usopp's dream in present day is a lot better than what she had thought in Little Garden, as back then the gag was that she just could not wrap her head around what Usopp saw in the Giants. Usopp's goal was not to simply go to Elbaf, but to become a brave warrior of the sea like the Giants of Elbaf. I'm glad this is getting brought up again, and it really is nice to see Nami be a bit more sympathetic toward Usopp's ideals after all this time, but we do have to wonder if Usopp will simply be satisfied with just being on Elbaf, or if he'll be pushed into realizing his actual dream of self-improvement. In all of his drunken excitement, Usopp ends up asking Jarl what kind of women he is into, to which the elder replies, an older one. The gag here is of course that Jarl was said to be the oldest living giant in the world, so there wouldn't be anyone older than him, and normally I wouldn't think twice about this sort of line being a joke, but it should be noted that this is also what the chapter is named after. Usually chapter titles refer to the most poignant part of the chapter, or sometimes highlight a thematic beat, so to name this entire chapter after a simple gag seems a bit strange, especially when you consider that far more pressing things have happened, such as Loki being freed. I have to wonder if this line is actually indicative of a plot point that is to come. Jarl saying he prefers older women does not necessarily have to mean that he likes women that are older than him, but rather just women on the older side. We've been wondering if there were other giants from Jarl's generation around, and perhaps he has a partner that we have yet to see. The woman in question does not even have to be old relative to Jarl, she could just be perhaps older than Nami. This may be a bit of a stretch, but could there have perhaps been some sort of relationship between Jarl and Mother Carmel all those years ago that we never got to see? There's been something off about Jarl ever since he was reintroduced, and I don't just mean him having a sword stuck in his head, which Usopp compares to the real-world legends of Excalibur, King Arthur's mythical sword. This is not the first reference to this legend in the series, as we saw Diaz Drake use a technique named after it back on Wano. Now, while Brogy believes that pulling out the sword will cause the chieftain to lose too much blood, I wonder if there's more to it than just that. Could the sword be affecting his cognitive abilities in some ways, perhaps even intentionally? Either he's using this injury as a way to present himself as unassuming and play dumb to hide something, or perhaps the sword has somehow been placed in such a way to block his memory. There are a lot of ways this could go, and I'm really interested in seeing what is really up with Jarl, especially after we realize that the sword in his head looks identical to the sword that we saw held by Harold in this portrait. Elsewhere, we find Roto having having asked Gerd to help treat the guards who had been injured in the castle. She wonders why they're in this condition to begin with and quickly sees through Roto's lies, but it is interesting that Roto had always wanted Loki to have been sent away. This kind of works to explain why Roto was so willing to help the Straw Hats free Loki in the first place, as it was always weird that he was the only giant in Elbaf who didn't seem to be worried about all the dangers surrounding him. I've talked about it before on the channel, but there are some interesting parallels between Roto and Loki, with both of them being introduced in this arc as people who believe themselves to be the sun god, both of them having command over various animals, and even them effectively enslaving humans to live within their domain. We also saw that Roto was being bullied as a child, so maybe he can somehow relate to Loki's position of having been seen as an outcast or something like that. Now down in the underworld, Luffy and Zoro find Loki in his bloodied state that the Holy Knights left him in. Luffy's unable to free Loki here since he's forced to interact with the Sea Stone that binds him, which really helps to paint the picture of how much Sea Stone was needed to keep Loki down, if just a little bit here is enough for Luffy to start feeling weakened. Zoro protests against freeing the accursed prince after seeing him in person, as we learn that he's as big as oars. We figured he had ancient giant blood since he was the son of Harold, but to think that he's that much larger than everyone else is very interesting. I suppose this would mean Harold was also similarly large, and perhaps even Jarl has ancient giant blood, given his size. The panel of Luffy and Zoro arguing is very reminiscent once again of the panel that we saw a few chapters ago of Roger and Gabon, which we also compared to previous scenes of Luffy and Sanji. Now after realizing that Loki is actually in an injured state and not just faking it, Zoro comes around to freeing him, but only on the condition that they leave some of the Sea Stone on him. He also makes the suggestion that they could use the injured animals to feed him, to which Luffy does not take kindly to, since he ended up befriending them earlier in the arc. We've seen Luffy develop this stance of not eating animals who are his friends before as well. Zoro goes to free Loki, and the new giant warrior pirates, along with Sanji, come falling out of the sky in a scene that's somewhat reminiscent of Luffy's group arriving at Marineford. Given the urgency of the situation, they had taken the Svar down to the underworld, but since the island clouds cannot retain their composition in these conditions, they were forced to crash down abruptly. They do mention that there was no time to use the lift, implying that there may have been another way to travel between the Sun World and the underworld that we aren't yet privy to. Thankfully, Luffy is able to save them, sort of, by breaking their fall with a huge gum-gum balloon. We've seen him use this sort of move to intercept large targets throughout the series, but I have to imagine that this is the most we've seen him expand in base form, given how this must be larger than even his pre-time skip giant balloon, and potentially even the Gear 5 usage against Kaido, or perhaps even the Dawn balloon used against Mars. In this panel, we also get another look at Goldberg's shield, who can be seen with a shocked expression. Last we saw it, it had been sleeping, so I'm hoping that we finally get it in action soon, so we can get some confirmation on whether or not it's a homie. Sanji jumps off in an attempt to catch Gerd, while the rest of the ship is sent bouncing back into the air, but as it turns out, this outcome was much better than the certain death they would have faced otherwise. With this, Hyruden pleads to Luffy not to free Loki, explaining how they figured everything out from Roto and how Loki is not to be trusted. You can also really see the size difference between the new giant warrior pirates and Loki behind them, and for some context, Hyruden was said to be around 72 feet tall on the Vivre cards, while Oars was over 3 times the size of your average giant, coming in around 219 feet. Given this drastic difference in height, it makes a lot of sense that it took all of Elbaf's warriors to stop Loki. Unfortunately, Zoro has already unlocked most of his shackles, which brings us to this outstanding spread of Loki towering over Luffy with a smile on his face. At last, the accursed prince is free, and he immediately goes to grab his weapon, the large hammer that we have seen on his back this whole time, which Hyruden reveals is named Ragnir. This, of course, is a reference to Mjolnir from Norse mythology, the hammer wielded by Thor, the god of thunder, as well as potentially a reference to Ragnarok, the catastrophic event that was prophesied to destroy the world in Norse mythology. Now, the Japanese name here is written using the kanji for iron and thunder, which once again nods to the Mjolnir inspiration, but I wonder if this could also hint at the weapon's abilities. We saw Hyruden's fists could be compared to bolts of lightning before, so perhaps this hammer has similar properties. We should also talk about why they even chained up Loki with his hammer in the first place. You would think it would be common sense to disarm someone when restraining them, but what if this also is intended to work as a nod to Mjolnir once again, where it is only able to be lifted by those who are worthy? Whether that is through some sort of magic property, or devil fruit power, or even just being way too heavy for a normal giant. This sort of echoes the allusion to Excalibur earlier on in the chapter, with it being another weapon that could only be wielded by someone who was deemed worthy. Now, we know that Loki was said to have acquired a fruit that was passed down along the royal family, and presumably, he ate that fruit after killing Harold. There's always been some potential logistical issues to track with this idea, such as Loki having to be able to find the fruit after it respawns in the case that Harold was the previous user. There was also the alternate possibility that the fruit was actually just physically passed down instead, but what if there is another potential outcome where the fruit was actually eaten by the hammer, Ragnir, and that weapon was what was passed down throughout the generations? This would be a much more consistent way of making sure that the fruit did not fall into an outsider's hand upon the death of the wielder. Perhaps that's why the Giants are so afraid of Loki in this instance, even though he still has Sea Stone on him, because the true threat is the weapon that he wields. I guess that begs the question of why restrain Loki with Sea Stone at all, if it's not even him who has the Devil Fruit abilities. So who knows, maybe he has a Devil Fruit as well, and we're about to see a Devil Fruit user who wields a weapon that has a Devil Fruit. Could be interesting if Elbaf is finally the arc where we get an explanation for how to put a Devil Fruit into an object between this and Shamrock's Cerberus. Though it is interesting how Loki was able to stay conscious despite being chained up with so much Sea Stone. Meanwhile, Luffy starts to pass out from just touching a little bit. Almost as if Loki may not have a fruit to begin with, but who knows? I'd love to hear what you think. What do you think about the possibility of Ragnir being a Devil Fruit infused weapon, and what do you think that or Loki's Devil Fruit ability may be? Let me know down in the comments. You can find all of my other manga breakdowns in the playlist on screen, and as always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.